Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Now without wasting any time, let's start Reddit story. With Minecraft in background, I found the receipt for a burner phone tucked inside the lining of my wife's favorite designer handbag, and in that single moment, the last 3 years of my life didn't just flash before my eyes, they felt like they were being erased. We weren't the couple that had secrets, or at least that's what I told myself every morning when I kissed Sarah goodbye before heading to the office. We were the golden couple of our suburban neighborhood in Oak Creek, the ones who still held hands at the grocery store and finished each other's sentences during dinner parties. But as I sat there on the edge of our king-sized bed, holding that crumpled piece of thermal paper from a convenience store 3 towns over, the silence in our house felt heavy, like it was suffocating me. Sarah was in the shower, the steam probably fogging up the glass, just like she was fogging up the reality of our marriage. I remember thinking how mundane the day had been up until that point. I had come home early to surprise her for our 3rd anniversary, carrying a bouquet of peonies and a reservation confirmation for that upscale French place she'd been hinting about for months. I needed to find her lipstick to touch up a scuff on a wooden frame I'd bought as a gift, and that's when I felt the strange lump in the silk lining of her bag. It wasn't a lipstick. It was a paper trail to a double life I never saw coming. When she finally stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a plush white towel and humming a song we'd danced to at our wedding, I didn't say a word at first. I just watched her, looking for a sign, a flicker of guilt, or even just a hint of the woman who would need a second phone. She looked so beautiful, so familiar, and yet, looking at her felt like looking at a stranger wearing my wife's skin. She noticed me sitting there and gave me that bright, easy smile that had always been my weakness. She asked me why I was home so early, her voice light and airy, and for a split second, I almost crumpled the receipt and threw it away, wanting so desperately to believe that there was a logical, innocent explanation. But the receipt was dated 2 weeks ago, and it was paid for in cash. I held it out toward her, my hand shaking just enough for the paper to crinkle, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Her smile didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, calculated neutrality that I had never seen before. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, and she didn't deny it. She just stood there, the dampness from her hair dripping onto the hardwood floor, and asked me why I was digging through her things. That was the first red flag I should have seen months ago, the way she had become increasingly protective of her privacy. I had brushed it off as her needing space because her job at the architectural firm was getting stressful, but now I realized it was a fortress she was building. I asked her point blank if she was seeing someone else, and the way she hesitated, just for a heartbeat, told me everything I needed to know. She finally told me it wasn't what I thought, that she was just talking to an old friend from college, someone who understood the pressure she was under. But we both knew that you don't buy a burner phone to talk to a college friend about work stress. The rest of that evening was a blur of half-truths and redirected blame. She told me I was being paranoid, that my long hours at the firm had made me cynical, and that she felt lonely. It's funny how the person who betrays you always finds a way to make it your fault. I wanted to believe her so badly that I actually apologized for finding the receipt. We went to dinner that night, sitting across from each other at a candlelit table, eating expensive food that tasted like ash in my mouth. I kept looking at her, trying to find the Sarah I knew, but all I saw was a woman who was very good at keeping a secret. Over the next few days, I became a version of myself I hated. I was checking her phone when she slept, tracking her mileage, and analyzing every word she said for a hint of a lie. I felt like a detective in my own home, and the evidence was mounting. There were late-night, work emails that required her to step into the other room, and sudden weekend errands that took 4 hours instead of 1. The intimacy between us became performative, a series of scripted touches and hollow, I love yous, that felt more like a habit than an emotion. I was living in a ghost story, haunted by the memory of a marriage that was already dead. I just hadn't accepted it yet. I decided to follow her on a Tuesday, telling her I had a late meeting, but instead sitting in my car 2 blocks away from her office. When she walked out at 5 o'clock, she didn't head toward the parking garage. She walked 3 blocks down to a small, nondescript coffee shop and met a man I'd never seen before. He was older, dressed in a sharp suit, and the way he touched the small of her back as they walked inside made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't the touch of a friend. It was the touch of someone who owned a piece of her that I thought belonged only to me. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, watching them through the window. They weren't fighting or looking guilty. They were laughing. I didn't confront her then. I couldn't. I was too terrified of what would happen when the lie finally broke. I drove home and sat in the dark, waiting for her to return with another story about a long meeting and a difficult client. When she finally walked through the door, smelling of expensive coffee and a perfume I didn't recognize, she looked at me and asked why the lights were off. I told her I had a headache, which wasn't a lie, because my entire world was starting to throb with the weight of her deception. I realized then that the woman I loved was a masterpiece of fiction, and I was just the audience member who had stayed too long after the curtain fell. The next few weeks were a descent into a kind of madness I didn't know existed. I stayed silent, playing the part of the oblivious husband while I systematically dismantled the life we had built. I hired a private investigator, a man named Miller who spoke in low tones and didn't seem surprised by anything I told him. He told me that what I was experiencing was the standard playbook for a long-term affair. He started trailing her, and every few days, he would send me a file that felt like a punch to the gut. Photos of them at parks, at hotels, and even at a small apartment in the city that Sarah had apparently been renting under her maiden name for 6 months. The man was Mark Sterling, a senior partner at a rival firm. He was married, too, with 2 kids and a house that probably looked just like ours. Seeing his face made the betrayal feel more clinical, more calculated. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a curated, secondary existence. Sarah was living 2 lives, and she was doing it with a terrifying level of proficiency. I would watch her cook dinner, talk about our future, and plan our summer vacation, all while knowing she had spent her lunch break in another man's arms. The cognitive dissonance was enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind. I started documenting everything. I saved bank statements that showed strange withdrawals. I kept a log of her late nights, and I even managed to get into her cloud storage one night while she was in a deep sleep. What I found there was worse than the photos. It was the messages. They weren't just sexual, they were deeply emotional. She told him things she had never told me. She talked about how suffocating our life in the suburbs was, how she felt like she was playing a role with me, and how he was the only one who truly saw her. Reading those words felt like she was reaching out of the screen and tearing my heart out with her bare hands. I think the hardest part wasn't the physical cheating. It was the realization that she had been unhappy for a long time and had chosen to lie to me every single day rather than have a difficult conversation. She had let me believe we were happy while she was building a backdoor out of our marriage. I would look at our wedding photos on the mantle and wonder if she was lying then, too. Was the I do just part of the script? Every memory we shared was now tainted, recontextualized by her betrayal. I couldn't remember a single happy moment without wondering if she had been texting him 5 minutes later. As Miller gathered more evidence, I started preparing for the end. I consulted a lawyer, a sharp woman who told me that since we lived in a state with specific laws regarding marital assets, I needed to be careful. She advised me to stay calm and not confront Sarah until we had everything in order. So, I continued the charade. I went to her sister's birthday party and smiled. I helped her pick out new curtains for the living room. I even slept in the same bed as her, though I would wait until she was asleep to let the tears fall. I was mourning a woman who was still sitting right next to me. One night, Sarah came home later than usual, looking disheveled and frantic. She told me she'd been in a minor car accident and was shaken up. I looked at her car and saw a dent in the bumper that definitely wasn't there that morning. But then I looked closer and saw a smear of blue paint, the exact shade of Mark Sterling's luxury sedan. Miller had told me they'd been seen arguing outside the apartment earlier that day. She was lying to me about an accident that happened while she was with her lover. I felt a surge of rage so intense I thought I might actually black out, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I told her I was just glad she was okay and offered to make her some tea. The manipulation was getting harder to stomach. She started acting more attentive, almost as if she sensed the walls closing in. She would buy my favorite snacks, suggest movie nights, and try to initiate intimacy more often. It was a classic guilt cycle, Miller told me. She was trying to convince herself she was still a good wife by overcompensating in the areas she thought mattered. But all it did was make her feel more like a predator. I felt like a lamb being fattened up for the slaughter, and the irony was that I was the one holding the knife this time. The final straw came when I found a folder on her laptop labeled Relocation. Inside were digital brochures for apartments in Seattle, job listings at firms in the Pacific Northwest, and a flight itinerary for 2 people. She wasn't just having an affair, she was planning to disappear. She was going to leave me, probably with a note on the kitchen table, and start a new life with Mark. The betrayal was complete. She hadn't just cheated on our marriage. She had already moved on from it without telling me. I realized then that there was no saving this, and there was no talking it out. There was only the fallout. I called my lawyer and Miller that night and told them I was ready. We set the date for the reveal. I wanted it to be at home, in the space she had turned into a lie. I spent the next 2 days moving my most important belongings and documents to a secure location while she was at work. I felt like a ghost in my own home, packing up the pieces of a life that no longer belonged to me. By the time Friday evening rolled around, I was hollow. I was a shell of the man I had been 3 years ago, but I was also more focused than I had ever been in my life. I set the table for 2, just like I had done 1,000 times before. I put out the good china, lit the candles, and waited. When I heard her key in the lock, my heart didn't race. It didn't pound with anxiety or fear. It beat with a cold, steady rhythm. She walked in, looking tired but offering that same practiced smile. She asked what the occasion was, looking at the fancy setup with a mix of confusion and suspicion. I told her I just wanted to have one last special dinner before things changed. She laughed, a nervous, fluttering sound, and asked what I meant by changed. I didn't answer right away. I just pulled out her chair and waited for her to sit down. As she settled in, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, the culmination of Miller's work and my own silent suffering. I placed it on her plate, right on top of the silk napkin. She looked at the envelope, then up at me, the color draining from her face until she was as white as the candles. I told her, in a voice that was surprisingly calm, that I thought she might want to review the relocation plans one more time before she booked the flights. The silence that followed was different from the one when I found the receipt. This silence was heavy with the weight of total exposure. Sarah didn't reach for the envelope. She just stared at it like it was a live grenade. I sat down across from her and started eating my salad, the crunch of the lettuce sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. I told her I knew about Mark. I knew about the apartment. I knew about the blue paint on her car and the burner phone and the work trips that were actually weekend getaways to the coast. I laid it all out, not with anger, but with the cold precision of a judge reading a verdict. She tried to speak, her voice cracking as she whispered my name, but I held up a hand to stop her. I told her I didn't want to hear the excuses or the "I was lonely" speech. I told her I had read the messages where she called our life suffocating. That seemed to hit her harder than anything else. The realization that I had seen her inner thoughts, the parts of her she thought were safely hidden away with Mark, seemed to break the last of her composure. She started to cry then, real tears this time, not the performative ones she'd used to manipulate me over the last few weeks. But I felt nothing. The man who would have been devastated by those tears was gone. She started rambling, talking about how Mark had promised her a life she'd always dreamed of, how she felt like she'd lost herself in our marriage, and how she never meant to hurt me. It was the same tired narrative of every cheater, a desperate attempt to frame her betrayal as a journey of self-discovery. I asked her if she thought I was a character in her story that she could just write out when she got bored. She didn't have an answer for that. She just kept sobbing, her head in her hands, as the candles flickered and burned down between us. It was the most honest moment we'd had in years, and it was devastatingly ugly. I pushed the divorce papers toward her, already signed by me. I told her she had until Sunday to pack her things and leave. I told her the house was mine. I'd made sure of that with the lawyer, and that she could take whatever she could fit in her car. The rest would be donated or thrown away. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to be so ruthless. She asked where she was supposed to go, and I told her that was a question for Mark. The look of sheer terror that crossed her face made me realize something I hadn't considered. Mark wasn't going to take her in. It turned out that Mark's promises were as hollow as hers. When she called him that night, hysterical and looking for a place to stay, he didn't answer. And when she went to his office the next morning, he had his secretary tell her he was unavailable. Men like Mark Sterling don't leave their wives and their reputations for the women they use to escape their boredom. Sarah had burned her entire world down for a man who wouldn't even give her the time of day once the secret was out. She was alone in the wreckage she had created, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't rage. It was pity. The weekend was a grueling process of watching her pack. She moved through the house like a ghost, filling boxes with the remnants of our 3 years together. We didn't talk much. Every now and then, she would hold up an object, a souvenir from our honeymoon, a gift I'd given her for her birthday, and look at me with pleading eyes, hoping for a moment of reconciliation. But I stayed firm. I had spent enough time being the supporting actor in her drama. I was done. When she finally drove away on Sunday afternoon, her car packed to the roof, I stood in the driveway and watched her taillights disappear around the corner. The house felt cavernous after she left. I walked through the rooms, noticing the empty spaces on the shelves and the silence that seemed to have settled into the walls. It wasn't the victory I thought it would be. I didn't feel empowered or free. I just felt tired. I spent the next few months in a daze, going through the motions of the divorce and trying to figure out who I was without her. I had spent so much of my identity being Sarah's husband that I didn't know how to just be myself. I went to therapy, I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected, and I buried myself in my work. One evening, about 6 months later, I was at a small bar downtown, having a drink by myself. I looked up and saw Sarah standing by the entrance. She looked different, thinner, tired, her hair a mess. She saw me and hesitated, then walked over. She didn't try to sit down. She just stood there and apologized. Not the frantic, self-serving apology from that night at dinner, but a quiet, hollow one. She told me she was living in a studio apartment and working a job she hated. She told me Mark had moved his family to another state and she hadn't heard from him since the day she left. I looked at her, and I realized that I didn't hate her anymore. The rage had burned itself out, leaving only a dull ache where our life used to be. I told her I accepted her apology, but that it didn't change anything. We couldn't go back, and I didn't want to. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and walked away. I watched her go, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The story of us was over, and while the ending wasn't what I had imagined when we stood at the altar, it was the only one that was honest. I walked out of the bar and into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I didn't know what the future held, and for the first time, that was okay. I had survived the betrayal, the lies, and the collapse of my world. I was still standing, and that was enough. As I walked toward my car, I realized that the hardest part of being cheated on wasn't losing the person you loved. It was realizing that the person you loved never really existed in the first place. But in the space where that ghost used to be, I was finally starting to find myself again. And that, I decided, was a story worth telling.